Pest and Predator podcast is brought to you by FieldHeroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. Welcome to the Pest and Predator podcast, brought to you by FieldHeroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. I'm your host, Sean Haney, founder of RealAgriculture.com. Today's guest in the Pest and Predator podcast is Dr. Maya Evenden. She is with the Faculty of Science and Biological Sciences at the University of Alberta. Maya, welcome to the Pest and Predator podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so right off the top here, I need you to define this for me. What is the ecology of fear?
Okay, so the ecology of fear is kind of like a framework that is used to understand the stress experienced by prey items. So that this kind of stress that is caused by interactions with predators or natural enemies that isn't actually them being consumed, but them being aware of the natural enemies in the environment. And therefore, it is kind of refers to this stress or fear, if we put a sort of anthropomorphic term on it.
Okay, so is it sort of like, if I go into the woods, I'm scared of a bear, and so I don't go too deep in the woods, kind of thing? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
It's kind of like that, except you sense the presence.
Okay.
So it's when they're able to sense the presence of a natural enemy, and then it changes, it alters their behavior or even their morphology and physiology, and that can impact population dynamics without actually having the predation occur.
Oh, interesting. So we have consumptive and non-consumptive effects. So how does that impact some of these biological controls?
Okay, so consumptive is basically the result from direct prey consumption. So the natural enemy impacts the prey population density by actually consuming it. On the other hand, non-consumptive effects are the effects, and these are usually thought to be negative effects on the herbivore or the pest, that result from the mere presence of the natural enemy, but they don't involve being directly consumed. So the non-consumptive effects of both predators and parasitoids can alter the traits of the prey. In this case, we're talking about maybe a crop pest, by negatively impacting their behavior. So oftentimes it'll result in less feeding and more sort of hiding and putting having escape strategies that can really significantly negatively impact the growth, development, and reproduction of the herbivore or the pest.
So when I think about when I think about biological control, a lot of times and many people do, I think of consumptive effects, right? Like that predation.
Yeah.
But so which one's more common?
So I think they probably both happen in all instances. Well, they both happen when there's a direct consumption effect, because the natural enemy has to be there, and likely the prey item will sense that natural enemy, even if it does eventually get eaten. But in some cases, when direct consumption doesn't occur, the stress associated with sensing the natural enemy still occurs. So I would say the non-consumptive effects happen all the time. And then the two of them happen together when you have consumptive effects.
This is super fascinating. So you've been studying non-consumptive effects. Like, I'm very curious. What did these experiments look like? Like, how do you set this up?
Yeah, so we started by using a lab setup where you have Well, we use diamondback moth as our prey item, and we use different types of natural enemies that it would naturally encounter in the cropping environment. So we did these studies using a predator, the seven-spotted ladybird beetle, and parasitoids, Diadegma insulaire, which is a parasitoid of larval diamondback moths. So the way we did it was we set up various treatments. We had the first treatment was we just had diamondback moths associated with the natural enemy, and the natural enemy was free to move around and consume the prey item. Everything was normal. That was just the intact natural enemy. And then a second treatment, we had manipulated natural enemies. So these were natural enemies that could still move around and pursue the diamondback moth prey, but they weren't able to attack it. So in the case of the ladybird beetles, we had removed the mandibles, the chewing mouth parts of the ladybird beetle, so it couldn't actually physically attack the prey. And in the case of the parasitoid, we had glued the ovipositor, the tube that they lay their eggs into the host with normally, we glued that so they were unable to lay the eggs. So here the prey was still exposed to the natural enemy, the movements and the presence of the natural enemy, but the natural enemy couldn't attack it. Then we had a third treatment where the natural enemies were actually physically constrained. So they were in a little mesh bag. So the prey item could still smell the natural enemy and could still kind of see it through the mesh bag, but it couldn't detect any movement associated with the natural enemy. And then the fourth treatment was we just had the diamondback moths without any natural enemies as our control.
Okay, to see how they just react and what they do without the threat.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
how does the diamondback moth how does it detect its predators or the parasitoids that you just talked about? What's its mechanism to do that sensing?
Well, the insects can insects in general have really good sensory a very good sensory system. They're able to sense all different types of cues. So it's likely that the diamondback moth is either using visual cues, olfactory cues, because lots of insects rely very heavily on their sense of smell. But vibration cues, even auditory cues, or if they let the natural enemy get so close, they could even respond to tactile cues, so being touched by them. So they have their bodies are covered in different sensory receptors. Most of them are located on the antennae, but they also have them on their tarsi, like their feet, as they move around. And so those sensory receptors are sort of tuned into these various cues. And so how the diamondback moth actually sense the predators could be any one of those. And that's sort of why we did those various types of treatment to try and narrow it down as to which ones were the most important.
Maya, the reason that they have such strong ability to sense because everything's trying to kill them. You would too. It's very, very fascinating. Okay, so when we look at the combined effect of both consumptive and non-consumptive effects, how does that fit into what we've talked a lot about with FieldHeroes? How does this puzzle come together?
Yeah, so with FieldHeroes, we're looking at, the naturally occurring um, carnivores in the system that will help farmers to control the plant feeding insects. And so what's probably happening in all of those cases naturally is that it's going to be a combination and maybe even an additive benefit of having both the consumptive and the non-consumptive pressures. So in some cases, perhaps when a ground beetle is feeding on something, another member of the pest species may be able to detect that, and it's going to be running away instead of feeding. And so it's another benefit to the farmer because the feeding behavior is being diverted to escape behavior. And so the pest spends less time feeding and therefore has reduced damage to the crop.
You know, we're like in season 6 of Pests and Predators, and I have learned so much about what's happening inside that crop canopy. And one of the things I'm fascinated by is how we find out like what's a beneficial, like in terms of like that insect loves to prey on that other insect, that which is a good thing because it's those, so field heroes, they're beneficials working for us for free. How do we find out when there's non-consumptive effects? Because we're not actually seeing the actual predation or the consumption. Like, how do you find some of this stuff out?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and a lot of it will vary with density of the populations as well. But one way to look at it is to look at the actual damage with and without the presence of the natural enemies. So there'll be a certain portion of the population that actually gets predated upon, and then the remaining part of the population may be scared to some degree and therefore feed less. So the only way you can really tell that is to do these direct comparisons where you're measuring that feeding damage or things like eggs laid in an area where there's predators versus where there's not predators. So those are the kinds of measurements that really show non-consumptive effects. But it's less easy for someone just to go into the field and say, "Oh, look, this is happening." So it does have to be done under controlled conditions so that you can get a measure of the difference that sort of presence of the natural enemy is making.
Oh, very cool. Okay, so let's start with some of the major findings of the studies using predator and parasitoid natural enemies. What'd you find?
Yeah, for sure. So what was really interesting with the study on the predators, so the seven-spotted ladybird beetle predators, is that the results depended on whether the predator was in its larval stage or its adult stage. So the ladybird beetles are predators in both stages, and they consume diamondback moth larvae in both stages. And so what we found was that the presence of the free-moving adult beetles that did not have mandibles, the ones that couldn't actually feed, but they could move around and harass the diamondback moths, their presence resulted in reduced feeding damage by the diamondback moth larvae. So the larval feeding was actually reduced because of the presence of this predator running around without mandibles that couldn't eat the prey item. But interestingly, when the larval predator was used, there was no effect on the diamondback moth larvae feeding, which suggests that for the larval predators, the non-consumptive effects were not as important as for the adult predators. So it seems like the diamondback moth larvae were more scared of adult beetles than they were of immature larval beetles.
Oh,
So that
okay.
was kind of a cool finding.
Yeah, that very much so, absolutely. So if we take this to field scale, how can we measure this in the field, and does the situation change at all?
So you can measure this in the field, but it's a little bit more difficult. But you can still do these manipulations where you add predators to an environment, predators or parasitoids to an environment, um, and measure the subsequent effects. So it's easier to do with constrained natural enemies. So like putting them on plants in the field, but having them like bagged so they can't actually attack the herbivores. Then you would do the same types of measurements, the sort of the larval seeding damage, the egg laying of pest species, and you do that in control areas where you haven't added natural enemies and treated areas where you have added natural enemies. But those natural enemies have to be modified because they can't actually exert their consumptive effects in order to study it. So it does make it a little bit more complicated to study in the field. But the cool thing also, I should mention the findings for the parasitoid under the lab studies.
Yeah.
So for those studies with the manipulated parasitoid that couldn't lay eggs, it also negatively affected the feeding behavior of diamondback moth larvae. So the feeding damage was reduced to the same level as it was when the wasps were able to attack the diamondback moth larvae, even though those wasps were physically incapable of laying eggs. So it appears that the presence of the wasp without attacking resulted in reduced weight gain of the diamondback moth larvae because they weren't feeding as much. And so that would mean less damage to the crop. So both of those instances, both for predators and parasitoids, there is a non-consumptive effect that does actually influence what they're feeding, how fast they're feeding, and eventually perhaps that could influence crop damage or reduce crop damage.
Can I guess the severity of the non-consumptive effects, can they change over time based on experience at all? Or like, I'm just thinking like with a dog. Like a dog has fearful experiences, and then we see the dog's behavior or what they're scared of going forward is altered. Same with humans, right? Is this also the case with pests?
Yeah, that's a great question. So insects definitely learn from experience. And so I would think that experience could influence subsequent response. Um, in addition, insects go through these very characteristic life stages. And so if they are exposed to the threat as a larvae, it may influence their later life stages as well. And there has been some research in the US looking at whether if you expose them to a predator in the, say as a young larvae, what does that do? How does that influence subsequent adult behavior? And so that's a wide open field, and there's lots of good questions there, and whether they're actually learning or there's an actual physiological change due to less food is another potential outcome from exposure.
Okay, so I'm very curious. What is some other research that your lab is working on then?
Yeah, so we just sort of dipped our toe into this non-consumptive effect. Most of our lab is working directly on the pests themselves in the various agro ecosystems. And one of our new projects that we just started last summer is looking at the effect of intercropping. And we're looking at intercropping between canola and pea crops and how that affects some of the specialist insect herbivores associated with peas and associated with canola. So we're looking at how, when you grow these two crops together, how it influences the behavior, biology, and fitness of things like diamondback moth and flea beetles that are specialists on canola, and the pea leaf weevil that's a specialist on pea. So the theory behind that is that this intermingling of the crops should confuse the insects, and maybe they won't use that habitat as well as they would a normal monoculture environment of the crop that they prefer. So that work is ongoing. I have a couple of PhD students working on that, and it's turning out to be pretty interesting. And we've kind of expanded it to look at the field heroes, both pollinators and natural enemies, in the intercrop system versus the monocrop. So that's something upcoming that we'll might have some interesting results about. And then the other thing I wanted to mention that is just a recently completed project is one of my students did a thorough study on entomological extension in Alberta. And so the way he did this was he conducted surveys of producers and of extension professionals. And he asked lots of questions about how was communication about various entomological issues working for them in Alberta. And one of the sort of deliverables that came out of his work was a online map, digital map to all of the extension resources available to that have information about entomology that are available to producers in Alberta. So that map is going to be posted on the Entomological Society of Alberta website so that hopefully as many people as possible can access it and find out where to get good information for questions they have about insects in their crops.
Well, Maya, this has been fantastic. This is very, very cool information. I really appreciate you joining us here today on the Pest and Predator podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's been really fun.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Pest and Predator podcast. It's brought to you by FieldHeroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm.